Sweet. Love me some cold water jerkbait fishing. In this video, I want to talk about one of my favorite techniques in cold water, which is fishing a jerkbait. This will never not be one of the best ways to catch bass in cold water. And really, to me, cold water is kind of anything below about 55 degrees. That's really when I keep a jerkbait on the front deck of my boat. But in this video, I want to talk about 3 really special tips that I think will help you to catch more fish with a jerkbait in cold water. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. Now, tip number 1 when it comes to fishing a jerkbait in cold water is select the right jerkbait. To me, I think that during the cold water months, fish are very specific on what they like when it comes to a jerkbait. And some days this is a color. You know, some days you have to have just the right color. You really have to kind of match what the fish are eating in order to get bit. Now, if you have a forward-facing sonar, a lot of times you're going to see followers come up on your jerkbait and go back down. And even if you don't have forward-facing sonar, you can watch to see if you have a lot of followers. Typically, when I see that I have followers on my jerkbait, that's when I know that something might be off with the particular jerkbait that I'm using. And a lot of times, the first thing I do is color. Now, to me, when it comes to color, I really like translucent type colors when I'm fishing in cold water. Most of the time, because when I'm fishing cold water, I am also fishing clearer water. And so I like those translucent colors. I think it allows the fish to see it, not too well, just enough to interest them, but not too much where it kind of scares them away. Now, the other big part about a jerkbait, and to me, I think that this might be the most important part about fishing in cold water with a jerkbait, is selecting a jerkbait that has a very slow sink to it. I think that this is really, really important. Now, if you guys have been around my channel, you know that I absolutely love the Berkley Stunna jerkbait. This is one that I have caught a lot of fish with, and this particular jerkbait was actually designed to sink very, very slowly. And when I say slowly, I'm talking like it takes several seconds for it to even go a half a foot. It's a very slow sink. And I actually kind of witnessed this firsthand years ago, where a slow sinking jerkbait got a lot more bites than one that was perfectly suspended. And the reason that I noticed this is because I was actually using one of my other favorite jerkbaits, which is the Megabass 110. I think for most jerkbait fishermen, this is a bait that a lot of us have. Now, the hooks that come on a Megabass 110 are very thin wired hooks, and they allow that jerkbait to perfectly suspend in the water. Now, during the cold water months, I really like to replace the hooks that come on a Vision 110 with Berkley Fusion. These are number 6 hooks. Well, now these hooks are slightly a thicker hook, and what it does is it makes that jerkbait sink very, very slowly. Now, what I was talking about, I was fishing this bait years ago. I was catching a ton of fish on it, and I had switched those hooks over to those Fusion 19s. Now, I didn't know at the time that it was causing that jerkbait to slowly sink until I lost that particular jerkbait. I tied on one fresh out of the package, but it had the old hooks. It had the hooks that actually come on a Megabass, and it made that bait perfectly suspend, and I literally stopped getting bites. I stopped getting bites completely. I switched back over to the hooks. I put the right hooks on, which caused that bait to sink a little bit, and immediately I started catching fish. This video is brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. Right now at Fin Fishing, all of my bass hats, which is a really unique hat made with a piece of bourbon barrel, are 15% off. I have a ton of new colors. So if you guys have been interested in wanting to buy one of these hats, click that link down below for the bass hat and pick one up. It greatly helps support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now, tip number 2 is in cold water, what you have to know is that everything in cold water is cold-blooded. And so when that water temperature really drops, nothing's really moving extremely fast in the water. Everything's just a little bit more lethargic in the water. So if you're working a jerkbait really fast and really hard, it looks unnatural to a bass. And this is something I have seen firsthand with the forward-facing sonar, and whether you have it or not, it's just something that you can still learn, is that you will see days where you're really pumping, snapping that rod really hard. You'll see fish come up to that bait and then shy right away. And a lot of times it's because of how aggressively you are working that fish. So a lot of times when I actually work a jerkbait in cold water, it's very small twitches. I'm casting that bait out and I'm just twitch. I mean, very small twitches under the water. That little bit of a lesser movement down there is just more natural to a bass. It's more enticing to a bass. And then the other thing that you want to do is make sure you pause that bait. Let it sit for a while. Now, about the maximum I will let my jerkbait sit completely still is somewhere between 5 and 7 seconds. This is something that I've experimented a lot with over the years, and I just find that I catch the most fish when that bait is somewhere between like 3 and 4 seconds. Even in really, really cold water, I've never really had to let that bait sit there for much longer. I know that there are guys, especially old school jerkbait fishermen, that will let that bait sit there for 20 seconds, 30 seconds. I literally physically cannot do that. I've said that before on this channel, and I cannot do it. So just know that you can still catch a fish letting that bait pause for about 5 or 7 seconds. It's something that's really, really fun to do, because to me, it's almost like catfishing. Like, you pop that bait a couple of times, again, softly, and then you just sit there. And then all of a sudden, you'll be sitting there, your line slack, bam, a fish hits it and starts to take off. It's like catfishing when you're just sitting there. I actually really, really like it. And it's a bite that not everyone has experienced, and you can really whoop a lot of guys out there on the water if you realize that you have to let that bait pause. Now, with it pausing and working it slow, always count. Always count, because then you will understand, hey, the bass are hitting it right at 3 seconds. And that's what they tend to do. They will have a certain amount of time. The other day I was on Lake Erie and the fish were a 4-second count. You would pop it a couple times, 0, 1, 2, 3, bam, line's moving off. That was almost every single fish that I caught, somewhere between 3 and 4 seconds. So just keep that in mind when you're out there with the jerkbait. Now, tip number 3 when it comes to fishing a jerkbait, and this is actually when you fish a jerkbait year round, this applies, is make sure you have the right rod. I think that the rod that you use is one of the most important aspects of jerkbait fishing. And to me, I actually like a really limber rod, something that has a lot of give to it, because typically when you're fishing a jerkbait, you're using pretty small hooks on that bait. The fish a lot of times are going to almost hook themselves. Like, you don't have to really, jack them on the hook set. But what does happen a lot, fish will shake a jerkbait. They will throw that jerkbait. It's a longer bait. They can kind of let it flip and flop. So using a really limber rod allows that fish to have a lot more give, and he's not gonna throw that bait. As soon as I started fishing these really limber rods, I stopped losing fish almost 100%. Like, I have a very good hookup to land ratio when it comes to jerkbait fishing, and it's all due to the rod that I use. Now, there's a ton of different rods on the market. The one that I really like, this is an ARC Tharp series. It's called a one-eye jack. This is a 6-foot 9-inch rod, and it's a medium. It is a very, very limber rod. It's almost too limber when you first start using it, if you've been used to kind of like more of a medium heavy power or fast action rod. But I'm telling you what, that rod, you will lose very few fish with that rod. And I've caught a ton of smallmouth on jerkbaits. They're going sky high all over the place, and you keep them pegged, you keep them on. So make sure you have the right rod. Now, one thing that I have also noticed when fishing a jerkbait is that there are just days that maybe it's kind of still, maybe you don't have a chop on the water, maybe the water is really, really clear, and no matter what jerkbait you use, color you use, vibrations, hooks, fall rates, no matter what, those fish are just not eating a jerkbait. And one of the best baits that I have found to kind of use in that situation as kind of a backup is what we call a Ned Mickey. Now, I actually sat down with Joey Nania and interviewed him all about this technique. It's one that has won a ton of money in the bass fishing world, and I'm gonna leave that video right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, watch this one. It's a great follow-up for the jerkbait.